Well, hey guys, welcome to week one of the Lakeview Christian Center Essentials course. My name is Keith Collins, and I know I have not had a chance to meet everybody who's here tonight. And my apologies, I'm so sorry not to actually be in the room with you and you're watching a video tonight, but we had originally scheduled to do week one a previous week, and I think it was one of the hurricanes, can't remember which one it was, Francine, I think, that relocated our fall schedule. And my wife and I are out of town this week, so regrettably we can't be here with you. I would look forward to meeting some folks that I know join us for these courses that haven't had a chance to be part of the church yet, and we're so grateful to have you. Let me just tell you quickly who I am. The rest of the folks who are part of the church would already know that. I've had the privilege of serving here at Lakeview Christian Center for over 30 years as a member of the pastoral team. And I think that's what gives me a heart to want to talk to us about some essential things that are going to be part of this course. So we've created something called the Essentials course, and it's going to run for 6 weeks. It'll have a different speaker each night. We're going to give you some take-home materials for you to benefit from and stir up some personal study as well. But let me explain to you a little bit tonight and preview the course a bit by giving you an idea. Why are we calling this an Essentials course? You know, when you go to do life, there are some things that just stick out, make noise, find their way onto your calendar, grab your attention, get in your world. Those things grab our attention, but then there's some other things that kind of don't make as much noise. But quite honestly, some of the things that don't make the noise, they're essential to the life that God has called us to live. So, in my background, I became a pastor in 1993. Before that, my background is as an engineer. I went to college for engineering. When they train you in engineering school, you have to pay attention to the way you design things. And you've got to pay attention down to the details, down to the small particles, because it's the little things, right? The devil's in the details. Well, big failures are in the details. So most of us know the story of like the Space Shuttle Challenger that took off, had the school teacher on it, Krista McAuliffe, and the rest of the crew. And they got about, I think, a minute into the flight, and suddenly we were all shocked with the massive explosion that took place in the sky and the loss of life and the tragedy of that. But then we came to discover that really the devil was in the details. The failure of that explosion was a gasket, a little rubber gasket that was part of the solid rocket booster. And the way it was designed didn't take into account how cold it was going to be the night before in Florida. They weren't used to that. So that was designed, and there was a really elemental thing that failed and caused this major catastrophe. What kind of life is like that? And your walk with Jesus is going to be like that. There are some things that maybe aren't the loudest things of our lives, but they're really essential things in our life. So tonight I want to organize some essentials for us as we have the rest of the course unfold in the coming weeks. Let me use this illustration. All of us are carrying around, we've got a device in our pockets, right? This device is full of apps, right? Remember years ago they said there was an app for that. And so we got hundreds of apps on our phones that do thousands of things. And when it comes to understanding the apps, we just want what they do for us. They want our calendar, we want our productivity, we want to play a game, we want to go on Facebook. We know what those things are going to do, but you know what? There's something running in the background of your phone that you're not paying attention to, but it's essential to making your phone operate, and therefore for you to enjoy any of the benefits of those apps. It's called the operating system. And it's not as glamorous as some of the apps are, but it's what makes your phone organize everything and put it in accessible ways so that you can actually be affected by the app. Now you're going to go open up apps, and let's face it, in life, we've got a lot of apps we open up. We've got moral apps that we open up that kind of steer us through life. We have relational apps that tell us how to relate to people, how to function. We've got goals and dreams apps. We've got things we want to be successful at, things we want to do with our lives. We open that stuff up and it's very important to us. Physical apps, emotional apps, spiritual apps. But something's got to make all that stuff run and make sense. And that's kind of what I want to talk to you about tonight. Now, we're going to function under this assumption in this Essentials course. We're going to assume that everybody here, now this may not be true, but it is the assumption we're making for the course. Everybody here has come to a place where they recognize how important it is to become a disciple of Jesus Christ. You've come to a place in your life where you've made a decision to surrender your life into his hands. And from this day forward, you want to follow him. So we're speaking to disciples. That's what the Bible calls a disciple. So we're not going to introduce you to making that decision as much as we're going to help you to flourish in the decision that you've already made. And maybe you just made that decision in the last few weeks. Great. We think the course is going to be very helpful in helping you get started on your first steps. Or maybe you made a decision to follow Christ years ago, but you haven't thought through what are the essentials that I need in my life to walk with Jesus. Well, that's what we want to go after in the course, and we're going to introduce that to you. Let me just give you a quick little background for where I connect with tonight's particular topic. And you'll notice, you've got an outline that's been given to you, and you'll notice the title there. The Essential Big Story is what we're talking about tonight. Now, let me just give you my first encounter with the Essential Big Story. I came to know the Lord in 1979. I was a high school student, and at that point in my life, I was living kind of fast. I had grown up a little quicker than most people who were my age. I hung out with older people. I had an older brother, and it kind of got corrupted in a number of ways. And so I was your early teenager who found his way into drugs and alcohol and trying to make a name for himself and trying to be cool amongst the cool people, etc. And I noticed one day, it was an amazing thing, and this is how God operates in our lives sometimes. I noticed that these people I was hanging out with, they were 3 and 4 years older than me, but they were doing the same stuff I was doing. They were still partying the same way and trying to do the same stuff on weekends, and something dawned on me. Is this all there is? Am I going to still be doing the same stuff I'm doing now 3 or 4 years from now? And it's like that question just messed with me. And it drove me to ponder, is there more to life than what I'm paying attention to? Well, that was kind of a big question for me, and that started me down a road. There was a Bible study going on at my school, so I decided, hey, let me go check out this Bible study and see what's happening there. And then that Bible study started me to read the Bible, and we're going to talk in the course about how essential it is that you read the Bible. Well, I started reading the Bible, and it started messing with my worldview, my ideas about how I was living my life. And it made me consider, did God have a plan for my life? And that phrase stuck with me. Somebody said it to me. God has a plan for your life. Well, that only makes sense if there is a God and he has a plan for everything. So that's kind of the operating system issue, right? God has a plan for everything about our lives. And we've got to figure out how our little story fits into his big plan. That's the real mystery of life. All right, so that's where we're going to go with the Essentials course. We're going to introduce some essentials that help us flourish in the plan that God has for our lives. So if you look in your outline, you'll see a little box in your first couple of pages there that says Table of Contents. All right, so here's where we're going in the coming weeks. Really, we've got 2 sections to this study. The first section is called 3 Essential Realities. They're ideas and concepts. We've got to get these right if we're going to walk with Jesus in a way that flourishes. And the second section is called 3 Essential Resources. All right, so the 3 essential realities are these. We're talking about one of them tonight. The essential big picture of our existence. How does my little existence fit into a bigger picture of all that's going on in the world around me? It's kind of like I need a blueprint. I remember when we were building this building, we had a blueprint that told everybody what to do. No matter what subcontractor it was, no matter who was doing the work that day, everybody read off the same blueprint. Well, God's provided some blueprint for life, and it's very important that we figure that out. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Hey, next week, the essential, part 2, will be the essential of the gospel. Let me say it this way. Understanding a moment in your life. And this is going to be an unpacking of the doctrine of justification. that something happened in our lives and it took place in a moment. It's not ongoing, doesn't keep on happening. It's something that happened one time for all time. You're going to learn about that next week. It's essential to understanding how to walk with God. And then week 3 is going to be about the essential of sanctification. And that's just a fancy word for growth and transformation in our lives. And unlike justification, sanctification is a process. It doesn't just happen in a moment. It's going to be ongoing. It's going to be happening every day of our lives for the rest of our lives. So that's the first 3 weeks, essential ideas for you and I to live this life with God. And then there's essential resources. And you just can't be a disciple if these resources aren't in play. All right, so week number 4 is going to be the essential ministry of the Word. So you're going to learn about the Bible, understand how to read it, how to study it, how to interact with it, how to let it interact with you. And then week 5 is the essential ministry of the Holy Spirit. You're going to hear something radical, that God's life itself has come to take up its presence inside of you. It's kind of to mix his life with yours, which means that the rest of our lives is going to be lived very differently than up until that moment. But some of us haven't learned how to cooperate and draw from and engage the Holy Spirit. Well, that's going to be week number 5. And then the last week, week number 6, is going to be the essential ministry of other people. God's purpose in you following Jesus involves other people. He's strategically going to put people in your life that are going to have an influence on your faith, on your walk, and on your ability to flourish as a disciple. We're going to learn about the ministry of other people in that last week. Now, I've got a chapter 7 there in your outline. We're not going to actually have 7 weeks, but everybody's going to reference this chapter, and everyone needs to hear that chapter 7 needs to be in every chapter because it's essential if you really want to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. And it has to do with personal prayer, personal study, personal interaction with God. The deepest dimension of my walk with God is personal. Now, my walk involves other people and it involves other resources, but the deepest impact of our relationship with God is personal. We've got to learn to spend time with God by ourselves. So every week, we're going to ask you to make sure you're doing that. We're going to provide some resources for you to do that each week relevant to the topic that we've talked about. And then next week you get to come back and talk further about those times that you've spent some personal time studying. But let me just say this one thing before I unpack tonight's topic. This is an essentials introduction. It is not an exhaustive course, it's an essentials course. And so we're not trying to say everything that needs to be said. That would take way too long. And we're not trying to tell you everything about each one of these topics. We're really just trying to introduce you to the topic so that you'll want to go further with it and you'll want to study more and get to know these things more. So we're going to do our best to kind of whet your appetite. Little sampler plate on each one of these topics so that you know, hey, I've got to pay attention to that and I need that in my life if I'm going to walk with Jesus. All right, so let me start with pondering essential number 1. I think I wrote this in your outline. How essential is it that you and I have some kind of life blueprint out of which we seek to understand what we're building? Right, something on the inside of us that everything, kind of a sounding board, everything bounces off of it. Everything seeks to find a place of making sense because we've got something that's sort of, it's like an operating system. It makes all the apps sit in the right places and do the right thing, right? And you know this, right? That little thing that just goes round and round and round on your phone sometimes. It's because the operating system's messed up, right? That's what's causing that. In a moment, the operating system is not functioning. And guess what? When your operating system stops functioning, your apps don't function right? So we've got to get our operating system right. Now, I don't know what's inside of you in terms of your own operating system, but there's a lot of ideas out there that are kind of marketing themselves and advertising that they've got a way to do this life, right? Hey, we're from Louisiana, so laissez le bon temps rouler, right? Let the good times roll is a operating system for some. The YOLO world that we live in, you only live once, kind of grab everything you can, take advantage of the opportunity. But I don't know if you've noticed, But the way people live their lives and the values that they have changed over time. I can remember, I'm not old enough to have been there, but I can remember the John F. Kennedy speech where he said something to the country that at that point made sense to everybody. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Right? It was this idea that, hey, we live for something bigger than ourselves. We serve other people. We serve a bigger cause. And in the 1960s, that kind of made sense to people. That doesn't make sense anymore. Over time, that's been jettisoned. And now we've been told over and over again, hey, how does this answer to me? What do I get out of this? What does this do to further my dreams and my desires, right? We've got ideas that get spoken to us like, hey, follow your own heart. Chase your dreams. Hey, dude, you do you. Well, these are kind of operating systems in our lives. As a matter of fact, Trevin Wax wrote an interesting book that invites us to rethink ourselves in these categories. And he said this about college graduations. He said, if you were to discern a main point from graduation ceremonies across the United States, you'd come up with something like this. The purpose of life is to discover yourself by looking deep down and then to express yourself, right? Welcome to social media, to the world, no matter what anyone else, family members, friends, colleagues, previous generations, or religious institutions might say. He has an interesting thing that he says in this book. He says he doesn't use operating system, but the operating system, so to speak, is this mode. As individuals, we look deep inside ourselves first. We figure out who we are. And then we look all around us to see who's in agreement with who we are. Those are going to be our peeps, and we're going to build our world based on people who reinforce our self-determined identity. And then we might look up, and we might define God out of what we discovered inside of us. So God gets to be who we want him to be based on who we've discovered ourselves to be on the inside. But as an operating system, if you will, when you open the pages of the Bible up, you find the exact opposite. God doesn't invite us to look at ourselves first. He invites us to look at him first. So the way in which we're called to operate and to do life is to first look up, figure out who God is and what is he up to and what's his big picture, and then look around and see how what God is doing in other places speaks to us when we go look inside in terms of who we're supposed to be and how it is that we're going to live out our lives. Hey, that's very, very different. All right, so I'll put in your outline there. Everyone needs an operating system that runs all their apps. It is essential that the way we define our existence, our identity, our purpose is carefully considered. And it's essential that we pay careful attention to this not getting hijacked along the way. So, hey, whether it's Plato and Aristotle doing existentialism and explaining to us our existence, or it's Taylor Swift and the Beatles telling us something about how to do life and how to enjoy life, or it's your mom and dad. Everybody's got an operating system. What's yours? All right, well, here's what we want to pay attention to tonight. Let's build an operating system. Let's build one that sounds like the one that God would want us to have so that we can actually follow him and flourish as disciples of Jesus. All right, every week I'm going to ask the guys who are speaking each week to introduce some key vocabulary to us. I always benefited from this in elementary school. All right, so here's some key vocabulary concepts for us this week. Worldview, right? Just a systematic way of thinking through, hey, what do we think about the world and how it exists and how it functions? Philosophy of life. Belief system. Right? That's what we're working on tonight. And we're going to narrow it into the Bible's belief system that's going to have 3 words in it. And this is where I want to leave us in a little bit. The word creation, the word fall, and the word redemption. Right? So we'll look at those at the end. But look at this thought from Greg Kugel. He wrote a book called The Story of Reality. And it really interacts with this thought. Matter of fact, we're going to give you a little bit of homework for you to take home and read from Greg's book. He says, what is Christianity? He says, well, some say Christianity is a religious system that people follow. Others say it's a guide to living a fulfilling life, or maybe a way of finding peace with God, or maybe
a system of ethical principles to live by. But some might say Christianity is not really a religion at all, but it's a relationship with God or a relationship with Jesus. But put another way, Christianity is a worldview, right? It's a way of seeing the world that we exist in. Everyone has in his or her mind a story about the way the world actually is, even if they haven't thought about it much or worked out all the details. And that's what we're doing tonight, trying to think about it. The story in their mind, as he calls it, is what people are referring to when they say that they have a certain beliefs about things like meaning and value, purpose and significance. Hey, when we react to the news at night, when we react to somebody having a political position on something, it's our worldview, it's our operating system that's compelling us to agree with that, to get behind it or to oppose it. He says, it is their belief system. If they did not have a basic story in their minds, they would have a difficult time making any of the important decisions people are faced in their lives. Right? Again, whether you just started to follow Jesus recently or you did this decades ago, it's essential that you have a belief system in place. And you kind of do, even if you haven't thought it through. And when life comes at us and we go to experience it, we're going to start labeling things good. Hey, that's good, or that's bad. Where did I get that from? Well, from my belief system, from the operating system that's guiding me as I do life. Hey, that's a toxic relationship. Or maybe that relationship is a trial of a relationship that's intended to do something for me that's beneficial, that takes me someplace good. Well, why would I believe that? Well, because my operating system might inform me to think that way. Maybe I'm staring at an event in my life and it feels empty and meaningless. But then I pull God's operating system into my story and I find out, hey, this isn't an insignificant event or moment. It's got significance and it has meaning. Well, where did I get that stuff from? Well, I got it from my operating system, right? I got it from the big story that I'm going to pull into my life. All right, now listen, we all have some big questions that we're asking about life. You know, if this were a philosophy class, you would be taught 3 big questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? And where am I going? And we live life every day trying to answer those questions and make sense out of our existence by asking those 3 questions. All right, I'm going to stick with the big 3, and we're going to venture into the Bible now. And we're going to say, hey, what's the Bible's storyline? When I pick up the story of the Bible, what's it trying to talk about? Well, listen, let me tell you what the Bible is not. It's not just some random moral stories that don't make sense, but they're just, like little short stories thrown here and there, and you just pick up any one of them and read them. And the moral of the story is be nice to people or learn to share. That's not what the Bible is. It's not Aesop's fables, and it's not a random set of proverbs that you can just open it up, flop it open, and point at that one and say, hey, my idea of the day is this. No, it's telling a story. And that story is a big story that's intended to inform our story, right? So I'm living a story, you're living a story. Like there's a certain day, there's a chapter you're in your own life, but my chapter is part of a bigger chapter, and so is yours. And so God is telling a story, and 3 words are going to teach us something about how to see the world that we live in. And this is the story that's in the Bible. These 3 words, as I said, are creation, fall, and redemption. All right, let's go after each one of those. Creation. All right, so I put in your outline there a little explanation. Here's my explanation. The doctrine of creation provides essential understandings for how we create definitions, how we assign purpose, how we locate authority. I mean, who says so? Who has the right to say so about what life is supposed to be like or what people are supposed to do? Creation reveals original design and purpose from which we draw our self-understanding and our self-identity, right? So before my story came along, there was already a story that was happening. And it began with the creation story. And if I listen to that story, it'll tell me about my story, right? Listen to this thought. Nancy Pearcey writes a foreword for The Story of Reality and says this. One of Francis Schaeffer's most memorable sayings was that Christianity does not start with Jesus saves you from your sins. It starts with, quote, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Christianity cannot be reduced to a tract or a technique for, quote, getting saved. It is a comprehensive account of the structure of reality, a rational and real world account of the history of the universe, a verifiable storyline of the unfolding of the cosmos. Listen, it is perfectly true that Jesus came to save us from the deforming disorder called sin. It's true. But starting with that theme is like going into a movie theater halfway through the film. You don't know who the characters are. You can't figure out the plot. And you are constantly guessing at the events leading us to the point. Most important, you cannot appreciate the depth and complexity of the problem that needs to be solved. Oh, that's so important. And, do we live in a world, all of us would say we live in a world that's got problems. But can I say it this way? We live in a world that has a problem more than any other problems, right? Piercy goes on to say, that illustrates a major reason the message of Christianity no longer makes sense to many people today. They are no longer familiar with the first part of the drama. As a result, not surprisingly, they cannot make sense of key concepts such as sin and salvation, right? So for our story to make sense, we need some backstory. We need to know, hey, what happened before we got here? And that's what the Bible is going to present. And it starts with creation. Here's another thought. Michael Lawrence, in his book, citing creation, he says, God's story begins with creation and it ends with a new creation. And if nothing else, this fact alone suggests that creation is crucial to understanding who God is and what he is about. Right, here's Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1 provides the cosmic overview. Everything that exists comes into being at God's command. And as we move into Genesis 2, the story focuses tightly on the details of the creation of mankind. Hey, where did we come from? The very first marriage is there, and the responsibilities entrusted to men and women. Everything is good. Everything is perfect. Everything is just as it should be. Right? So creation, this doctrine of creation gives us the idea of where did everything come from? Where did it originate? Right? That little bit of when I go to answer the philosophy question of where did I come from? I've got to go back to the creation story. This is where it all began. And it began with thought and intentionality. God thought things through. God had a design. God had a purpose when he created everything. Well, it might help me if I knew that purpose. Well, and here's an interesting point. All of us live in the world. We watch the news. We recognize stuff ain't working right around here, right? That little last line there. Everything's good. Everything's perfect. Everything is just as it should be. No, it's not. Not anymore. But what if you and I had a reference point that there was a moment on earth when everything was good and it was perfect and it was just as it should be? Well, wouldn't I want to know something about that moment to better understand how to fix what's broken with this moment? All right, well, that's what's important about understanding this doctrine of creation. One more thought from Mr. Michael Lawrence in his excellent book. He says, God created everything from nothing. Very important to realize. God didn't inherit anything, right? He's not making do with something that was previously created. He's the originator. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, Genesis 1. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. That's the opening of the Gospel of John. What this means is that God is the owner of creation. He made it, so it's his. That means you and I are his too. Hey, consider the systemic applications we can draw from this. Christianity isn't a social project aiming at cultural hegemony. It's a declaration that God has a legitimate claim on all our lives. Right? When I go back to creation, it informs me that Christianity is not just a bunch of people in the West imposing their ideas on the rest of the world. No. God created. He started things. And that informs what I believe and understand about my life today. Now, as we read the Bible story, things didn't stay good. That's where we get this next word. We go from creation to the fall. That's a big, important word in Scripture. Right? Here's my explanation of the fall there in your handout. The doctrine of the fall provides essential understandings to critical life elements like evil, sin, corruption, brokenness, pain, suffering, death, etc. The essential nature and need of man is revealed in the fall because something happened in this moment of the fall that changed who we were. The essential understanding of human conflict. Why do we not get along with people? Why is there trouble between other human beings? The essential understanding to the type of problem the gospel is suited to solve. There's a problem here in our world. It's not what you're being told most of the time. The problem is not education. If we just improve our school systems, everybody would live a better life. If people were just smarter and they were better educated and they could have a better life, they'd all get along. And that's not our main problem. It's more simple than that, quite honestly. It goes back to that big story that began before our story, the story of the fall. So let me just introduce you to a key piece of that. Again, this is just an introduction, not trying to be exhaustive here. If I go back to Genesis chapter 3, right? So we're only 3 chapters into the Bible, and we're going to hear the account, the story of the fall. And so here's how it begins. And I'm not going to read this whole passage, but it's in your notes, and you can go back and read it. Genesis 3 verse 1 says this. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, right? We know this is the scene of the Garden of Eden. If you're a little bit familiar with the Bible, you know this story. So the serpent comes along, and we know who this serpent is. This serpent is the character Satan in the Bible. So he said to the woman, hey, did God actually say you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it lest you die. But the serpent said to the woman, you will not die. For God knows that when you eat, your eyes are going to be opened, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit, and she ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened. All right, everything's changing now in our world. Their eyes are opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. And then the next thing they do is very important for understanding our own lives. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord. All right, what's that story got to do with my story? Well, it tells you some key characters that come on the scene and that have touched our world and changed it forever. So when I go to do life every day, there's a character in this world, and his name is Satan. And he's still in this world. He was in the story of creation and the fall, but he's still here. And he tempts people to do things outside of God's plan. And he's very good at it. And he's a deceiver. And when they gave into that temptation, sin entered into our world. So we've got 3 big players right away. Satan is in our world that we learn about. Temptation is in our world. And sin is in our world, and it's affecting every day of our lives. But if you keep reading this story, a 4th thing comes in, and this is where our problem comes from. If you read the rest of this story in Genesis 3, you're going to find out how God responded to this situation. He responded with judgment. There's something about God, and you'll hear more about this in the coming weeks, especially next week. There's something about God that he responds to sin with judgment. And you see that throughout the scriptures. It creates a problem. the humanity that God made, that God loved, has now gone off into a realm of sin, and God responds by judging man, puts him out of the Garden of Eden, and changes the whole world that he lives in to live in a different way and to feel a different way. Well, where do I get this understanding? Well, I get it from the doctrine of the fall. It's a worldview issue. This is the world that I live in. It's affected by Satan, temptation, sin, and God's judgment. And then if you fast forward, and I'm not going to read these passages because we're going to run out of time, but if you fast forward to Genesis chapter 6, you'll find just this first opening line. I'll just read verse 5 to you. This is hundreds of years later. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. All right, well, Genesis chapter 6 is a story, the famous story of Noah's Ark. And what God does in response to the evil, now the world is filled with evil, and the hearts of men are evil, so much so that God once again brings judgment again upon the earth, this time with water, and he floods the whole world, except for a man named Noah and his family. The mercy of God shows up, but so does the judgment of God. And then if I keep reading, right, in your outline, you get another passage there, Genesis chapter 11. Again, I don't have time to read it, but you can read it. There you hear the story of the Tower of Babel, right? The famous Tower of Babel. And it's another moment where God brings judgment upon man because the evil intention of man's hearts, and they're all together trying to do something that's contrary to God's will. And in that moment, God says, you know what? These guys are evil and they all speak the same language. They're going to corrupt each other. So God's judgment in that moment was to divide their languages and to scatter them upon the earth. And then there's one more passage in your outline there. It's what God says to a nation of Israel who belongs to him. Isaiah chapter 1. Hundreds of years later, the prophet Isaiah says this: "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. Children I have reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows its owner, the donkey its master's crib, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand." Listen to what he says. "Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, children who deal corruptly." All right, Isaiah is thousands of years removed from the moment of creation. But what is inside of man is ongoing corruption. The fall corrupted man from the inside out. And it's affected everything we know and understand about humanity. So when you and I look out at the events of life, the people around us, the relationships that we have, the things that we struggle with, and evil that's being done, wars that are being fought in this world, how do we process that? Well, we go back to the story that began before our story. The story of creation and the fall. Sin came into our world. And the problem that came with it is everybody's corrupt from the inside out. Now, let me just do this. I'm going to have to skip something here, but please go back and read a couple of these thoughts here. Again, some of this can be your own personal study time, but let me skip to this quote. I'm going to skip one quote and go to the second one here by Michael Lawrence, because he's going to make it really practical here. He says, so when your child, everybody there? So when your child turns 2 and begins to throw temper tantrums when he doesn't get his way, you may think of Romans 3:23, right? That's where all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And you'll also think of the book of Numbers, right? The story that goes before our story. Thousands of years of Israelite history. That's what Isaiah was talking about. And you'll know what's behind Romans 3:23 and what exactly your child is doing. He's worshiping an idol. Its name isn't Baal like the Old Testament idols, but it might as well be. Of course, this isn't just useful for explaining your 2-year-old's heart. It's useful for explaining your own heart as well. So who would have thought that your child throwing a temper tantrum because they're not getting their way at 2 years old, how do you explain that? How do you relate to that? How do you understand what to do with that? Well, you actually got to go back to the old story before our story and find out,
Every one of us are corrupt from the inside out. So when we go to do life, we've got something inside of us that needs to get fixed. And how's it going to get fixed? Well, tune in next week. You're going to find out there's a unique solution to this problem. It's essential to our lives, but that'll be next week. But it's kind of given away in my next word here, right? Here's our third word. It's the last word I'll cover tonight. It's the word redemption. The doctrine of redemption, in your outline there, it says this, provides essential understandings as to what actually fixes man's problem. All right, so session 2 will unpack the unique person and work of Christ, who alone solves our problem. But in this week, let's understand the big picture concept that redemption is restoring and reconciling relationship to God and access to his divine presence. Remember, that's what's lost in the Garden of Eden. They hid themselves from God, and then God kicked them out of the garden. So they've been removed from the presence of God. And that's the biggest problem any one of us is having every day of our lives. God created us for a unique, personal relationship with him. Sin and Satan disrupted that. And somehow that's got to get fixed. And your understanding of how that gets fixed is essential to the rest of your life. And that's really what this course is about. It's about making sure we've got the essentials in place so that when we go to do life, all of our apps can work, right? All the things that God wants to do in our lives, they can all work because we've got some essential understandings in place and some essential practices in place to walk this out with him. All right, I've got one other passage here. I'm going to interact with it really quickly because Romans chapter 8 is, hey, what does it look like when my little story meets God's big story? Well, that's what you're going to hear in this passage. So as I just read it, and I'm not going to interact with it very much for the sake of time, but in this passage, people like you and me are having a hard time. They're suffering. Life hurts. And they've got questions. And Romans chapter 8 is going to take the big story of God and going to impose it upon the little story of men. And we need this. And here's what it sounds like to take all that we've been talking about and impose it upon our own lives. Listen to this. Romans chapter 8, verse 18. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation, it waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning in the pains of childbirth until now. All right, so how do I explain my own groaning, my own sufferings, the sense of futility that I feel when life just comes up short? It's not satisfying. I do things that are really wonderful things, but I just feel empty eventually again. How do I explain that? How do I explain the fact that good people go bad? They do horrible things. Marriages that start out in love end up hating one another. How do I explain this corruption? Well, my story gets explained by God's backstory, by understanding that there's a past, there's a creation, there was intentions, and there was sin, and there was a fall. But God is at work redeeming this situation. And that's what next week is about. What does God do to fix this problem? Well, you read the rest of Romans chapter 8. Again, some of this is take-home material, so please take it with you. But remember this. When you and I go to do life, it's essential that these big three ideas are interacting with everything that we're doing and every belief system that we're creating. Creation, where did all this come from, and what was it designed and intended to do? The fall, why is it broken? Why does stuff not work? How do I make sense of the evil and pain of my life? And redemption, what is God doing right now in and around my life that he intends to fulfill in me?
All right, I'm going to ask everybody to do this, and I'll do this really quickly, and then I'm going to turn it back over to our host tonight, who's going to direct you into some questions that you're going to interact at the table for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll close the night with some little bit of time together. So each night, you're going to get some teaching time. You're going to have some reading materials that you've already gotten on board with, and then we're going to follow that time up with some discussion at tables. So you've got to put this stuff on and ask some good questions to each other and sort it out a little bit. But here's the one question I want to ask every speaker to make sure they include in their presentation. How has this essential doctrine impacted my life? How have I been affected by the idea that there's a big picture, there's a big story out there that has an influence upon my story? Well, it's helped me by putting me in my place. You know, I'm no different than anybody else. I want the whole universe to revolve around me, and I work hard. I'm tempted. That's what the devil does. He tempts me to make every person, every event, every activity, every course of history, everything that touches my life to be about me, about the way I want it and what I want out of life and what I find satisfying and rewarding and what I want people to think of me. And here along comes God's story, and it's a big, big story. And the bigger God's story becomes to me, the smaller my story gets. And I know that might sound like a good thing, but it's a very good thing, because my little story wants to dominate and control my life. It wants to corrupt everything. It wants to ruin my marriage. It wants to make my kids have to serve my agenda. It wants the church that I pastor to have to be about things for me. I would corrupt everything if you let me touch it. But God comes along with this big, big story, and my story gets to be this little story in the midst of a really great, wonderful, big story about Him. I get to learn that, hey, you know what, Keith? It's just not all about you. That's a good thing. That's a good thing for me and everybody in my life. But that word redemption, it means God's at work in my world. It means everything that's going on in my life, God is at work in it. And He's causing things to take place so that His purpose can get worked out in my life. That means even when things look like they're going bad in my life, God's in those moments with me, causing this to actually accomplish something good in my life. And that changes every day of my life. And then the last thing I would say, this impacts me as I live in a culture that's redefining everything around us. And changing the borders and the boundaries for what's acceptable and what's okay. Well, this big story provides me with God's ideas about, hey, where does everything go? How do you do being a man, being a woman, being married, having friendships and relationships? How do you do forgiveness? How do you do those things? Well, God's big story tells me how to do that in my little story. And can I just say again, it's essential that we get that if we're going to live flourishing lives for the glory of God. And God's got those purposes for you. All right, hey, thanks for joining us tonight. I do look forward to actually meeting you in person at some point when I get back in town. But let me turn this back over to our host tonight, and he's going to walk you through the discussion questions and let you spend some time at your tables. Thanks again.